Hi, I'm Tom Biebighauser with Wetland Restoration and Training. I've examined many dry lakes and dry wetlands across the West and the Southwest, and these lakes and wetlands have no inlet and no outlet for a stream, and they've been dry for many years, some of them as long as 50 years. Well, we've developed techniques for bringing water back into these valuable ecosystems. I'd like to show you how this may be possible if you live in an arid region to bring water back into wetlands and lakes. Let's get started. Shatanana Lake is located on the Yakinak-Nuk-Thiet First Nation Reserve near Grasmere in British Columbia, Canada. This aerial photo shows Shatanana Lake in July of 2013. Shatanana Lake is one of the few lakes present on the Yakinak-Nuk-Thiet First Nation Reserve. The lake is isolated with no stream inlet or outlet. Shatanana Lake was once supplied with water from streams. However, the water in these streams has been diverted for irrigation. Ditches were dug to divert the flow of water in the streams for irrigating hayfields on private land. Here a pump is being used to remove groundwater for irrigating hayfields. Shatanana Lake looked quite different historically than it does today. This map shows the estimated high water boundary of Shatanana Lake during a high water year. The blue lines show dry streams that once supplied the lake with water. The reserve receives little rainfall in the summer and fall. Ponderosa pine trees with smaller grass openings are what you see growing on the landscape. Grassland once dominated the watershed of Shatanana Lake. The roots of the pine trees captured rainfall before it could enter the lake. The dense growth of pine trees surrounding Shatanana Lake reduces how much water flows off the surface of the ground. A review of historical aerial photos, communications with community members, and ground elevation surveys show that Shatanana Lake has been drying over the past 50 years. This aerial photo shows that Shatanana Lake was full of water on July 28, 1968. Drying had caused Shatanana Lake to divide into two, as shown on this July 30, 1980 aerial photograph. Shatanana Lake had dried completely in this July 21, 2016 aerial photo. Shatanana Lake now consists of northern and southern halves. The two halves were historically connected with deeper water. Shatanana Lake North once held approximately 4 meters of water at its deepest point. An expert hydrologist tried to identify how to return water to Shatanana Lake without success. The lake has been mostly dry in recent years, with only a small temporary pool of surface water in what was once the deepest part of Shatanana Lake North. Crustacean shells and shell fragments that are found in soil test holes that were dug as part of the restoration design process show that Shatanana Lake contained perennial water for many years. Shatanana Lake once provided habitat for a large population of western painted turtles. Turtle shells and egg fragments could be found in the dry lake bed. 50 years ago, the elevation of groundwater in Shatanana Lake North was the same as the water elevation in the lake. The elevation of groundwater had dropped over 3 meters below the surface in the dry lake basin in October of 2023. Annual precipitation and snowmelt were not enough to both saturate the soil and return water to the lake. The drop in groundwater means that over 4 meters of precipitation would be needed to saturate the dry soil and fill Shatanana Lake with 1 meter of water because there are no streams entering the lake. This is not going to happen. The decision was made to begin the restoration of Shatanana Lake by first working to restore water to the northern half of the lake. We thought we could be more successful restoring Shatanana Lake North because groundwater was closer to the surface compared to Shatanana Lake South. The main goal for the restoration of Shatanana Lake North was to restore perennial water to provide habitat for wildlife. The project was led by the Yakinak-Nuk-Thiet First Nation in collaboration with the BC Wildlife Federation and Rewilding Water and Earth Incorporated. I visited Shatanana Lake with Jason Gravel, land manager for the Yakinak-Nuk-Thiet, on October 29, 2021. Grass was growing in the Shatanana Lake South. We observed mud and small puddles of water along with scattered clumps of sedges in the historically deepest part of Shatanana Lake North. Jason and I measured soil texture and checked for the presence of groundwater by using a 120 centimeter long tile probe and a short 100 centimeter long punch auger. We found hydric soil near the surface in Shatanana Lake North. The test holes we dug in Shatanana Lake North showed organic soil within 50 centimeters of the surface and silt clay from 50 to 100 centimeters below the surface. Water entered the test holes from the bottom and the sides and rose to within 30 centimeters of the surface. I recommended changing the primary source of water in Shatanana Lake North from surface water runoff to groundwater. Restoring the lake would involve using heavy equipment to excavate a deep basin in the silt clay soil that would intercept groundwater that was flowing in the sand layers. We would then loosen the compacted soil in the basin so that groundwater would rise to the surface. You may wonder if this technique works because it does not involve the use of wells, pumps, pipes, diversions, or dams. Let's look at similar projects we've completed where heavy equipment has been used to reshape the basins of isolated lakes and wetlands and reconnect them with groundwater. This dry, isolated basin we call Black Diamond Lake is located near Kamloops, BC. It was being used as a playground by individuals driving off-highway vehicles. Like many other natural lakes and wetlands in the southern interior region of British Columbia, it had gone dry in the past 50 years. The main reason the Black Diamond Lake had gone dry is that groundwater was no longer able to rise to the surface. The wetland was historically supplied with both surface water and groundwater, and it was in a region where there is very little rainfall. These cows must walk out into the mud of a drying wetland to find water to drink. The cows are compacting the clay soil in the wetland basin as they try to reach the open water and not get stuck in the mud. Another reason they're walking in the drying wetland is that this is the only place where they can find green plants to eat. Arid regions, sometimes the only water cows can find to drink is pooled in the tracks that another cow has left in the mud. The soil test holes we dug showed that the upper 1 meter of silt clay soil was so compacted that precipitation could not soak into the ground and groundwater could not rise to the surface. We found the same problem throughout the west and southwest where cows and horses have compacted the soil in the dry wetland and lake basins. Livestock activity in drying basins will separate surface water from groundwater under drought conditions. The problem is serious as cows will die when they can't find water to drink. We used an excavator to dig deep into a layer of sand that was carrying groundwater beneath the clay, and then we shaped a large basin with loosened soil in the bottom. Black Diamond Lake Basin filled quickly with groundwater. We built a fence around the restored lake, and we made a ramp that was graveled to provide livestock with easy access to clean and reliable water. The Black Diamond project was well received by livestock, wildlife, and the public. The Dry Tree Flats 2 wetland is located near Barnhart Vale in British Columbia, Canada. The upper layer of the basin is also compacted clay soil. Here's how the Tree Flats 2 wetland appeared shortly after restoration. This is Stud Pasture Lake before restoration. The dry basin is located near Kamloops in British Columbia. The Stud Pasture Lake has been dry for years. The small puddles of water are perched on a thick layer of clay that was compacted by livestock. We used an excavator to deepen the basin and to remove the cap of clay. The center of the basin was dug deep enough to interrupt a buried layer of sand that was carrying groundwater. The excavator operator had no experience working on wet ground and soon became stuck in the mud. We had to bring in a second excavator to pull the machine out of the mud. This experience taught us to provide logs for the excavator operator to use to keep from sinking. Here's how the Stud Pasture Lake appeared shortly after we removed the clay cap and loosened the soil in the basin. The level of water had significantly risen 1 year after restoration. Here's how the lake appeared 2 years after construction. Groundwater kept rising in the restored Stud Pasture Lake so much that we had to move the livestock watering ramp. The Hippo Logging Lake in British Columbia had been dry for years. Here, heavy equipment is spreading the soil removed from excavating and loosening the soil in the Hippo Logging Lake. You can see how much Hippo Logging Lake has filled with groundwater 1 year after construction. The game camera shows elk using the restored Hippo Logging Lake. Deer are also frequenting Hippo Logging Lake that now contains water. Here's Peavy's Pond in Baja California, Mexico. It's the day that we began construction. Here's Peavy's Pond 1 year later, now filled with groundwater. A California red-legged frog has laid this egg mass in the restored Peavy's Pond. The restoration of Shatanana Lake North required the use of large machines to move large quantities of soil. Ferentino Brothers Contracting supplied the heavy equipment and the skilled operators that were needed to complete the project. Here's a list of the heavy equipment and operators and the number of hours they worked to complete the restoration of Shatanana Lake North. The dozer on the right had wide tracks and was less likely to get stuck in the mud. The dozer on the left had narrow tracks and was more likely to get stuck in the wet ground. Robin Anschild and Sarah Yeomans with Rewilding Water and Earth Incorporated worked with the Yakaknuk Thiat First Nations personnel Jason Gravel, Adam Hunter, Myra Juckers, and Lane Twigg to supervise the project. Personnel were on site 100% of the time directing construction while the heavy equipment was operating. Ferentino Brothers Contracting provided wood mats that the excavator operators were to use to keep from sinking. However, these wood mats were of no value because they quickly broke into pieces under the weight of the machines. The wood mats fell apart because the wood was dry and the logs had been cut into squared timbers at a sawmill. The excavators were getting stuck in the saturated soil with their narrow 24-inch wide tracks because the wood mats were breaking apart. Here's what happens when excavator operators don't have logs to keep them afloat. They sink in the mud. Getting stuck costs time and money, but a larger problem is that excavator operators are reluctant to work in muddy areas if they're not using logs to stay afloat. Using logs is like wearing a life preserver in a leaking boat. It just makes sense. Approximately 80 logs were ordered and delivered to the site that were used by the excavators to keep them from sinking in the mud. The logs were freshly cut from green Douglas fir trees so they would be less likely to break. The excavator unloaded the logs from the trailer because the truck was not a self-unloader. The thumb attachment on the excavator allowed the operator to pick up and place the individual logs. The logs averaged 20 inches in diameter and were 20 feet long. The logs that did not sink into the mud during excavation were installed as turtle basking logs and as coarse woody debris with the cut ends that were buried and crushed so they would look natural. In addition, 70 logs that would be placed as coarse woody debris were delivered on site. The first step of excavation was to dig down into groundwater. They found there were 2 separate water tables in Shatanana Lake North. Identifying 2 water tables demonstrates the importance of digging test holes that are at least 3 meters deep when designing a wetland project. The groundwater I detected earlier was runoff that was seasonally perched on the silt clay texture soil only 50 centimeters below the surface. This was a weak supply of groundwater that would not have filled the excavated basin. The excavator dug 3.6 meters deep before reaching water in a layer of sand that was beneath the silt clay. Water rushed into the hole from a crack in the side and rapidly filled the excavation. The depth of the sand layer that was carrying groundwater ranged from approximately 2.1 to 3.6 meters below the ground surface. When I designed the project, I estimated we need to remove an average of 1.5 meters of soil during construction. However, finding the strong supply of groundwater deeper below the surface necessitated a change where it was now necessary to dig over 3 meters deep and remove twice as much soil to restore the lake. The historic high water mark in Shatanana Lake was determined by visiting the site with community members, examining historic aerial photos, and by measuring the elevation of where trees were growing. On the first day of construction, the perimeter of the planned basin and the center line representing the deepest water were flagged using colored plastic wire flags. A layer of topsoil that was approximately 60 centimeters thick was removed from the area to be excavated, and this topsoil was piled outside of the work area for later spreading over the mineral soil that we would be removing from building the lake. The rebuilding of Shatanana Lake North was a large project. You can see how much work it's going to take to remove and to save the topsoil. While the removal and replacement of the topsoil was a good thing to do, the action greatly added to the cost of the project and made it more difficult for the heavy equipment to avoid getting stuck on the wet ground. I normally leave the topsoil and vegetation in place to support the excavator and the dozer when there's a concern about getting stuck. An area of native sedges was removed and would later be spread along the edge of the completed lake. The sedge was handled carefully by the excavator operators to prevent crushing its rhizomes. Prior to excavation, elevations were measured in the deepest part of the existing basin, and this was in relative to the benchmark that was set on higher ground near the trees. This allowed the construction supervisor to keep track of how deep the excavator was digging relative to the original ground to reach the groundwater. The crew frequently surveyed the elevation of the excavated areas to ensure that target depths were met. To optimize winter habitat for western painted turtles, the project aimed to restore a minimum of 1 meter of perennial water in Shatanana Lake North. Water travels underground in buried streams of gravel and sand. It's of critical importance to cut into one or more of these underground streams when restoring a lake or a wetland. You may have to dig deeper than planned to hit these underground streams so your wetland will fill. You'll know when you expose an underground stream because the water will rush in just like you broke a water pipe. The excavator dug deep enough so there would be at least 1 meter of water in the lake when it was filled. Construction occurred in the fall, typically the driest time of year. Thus, the depth of water during construction was assumed to be at the lower end of the average water depths throughout the year. This photo taken by a drone gives you an idea how much soil is being removed, so there'll be at least 1 meter of water in the lake all year. You can see the pink wire flags that were placed to show the excavator operators where to dig the deepest. Notice how groundwater is beginning to fill the depression. The soil removed by the excavators was pushed uphill and spread by the dozers. The large excavators were important to the success of the project. The excavator operators were able to stay on high ground and dig down 4 meters or more into the ground. This was important because in many places it was necessary to dig 3 meters deep to reach the elevation of groundwater. The long reach of the machines enabled them to drop the soil uphill far away from the edge of the hole being dug. Here the excavator operators are using a relay to move soil uphill to higher ground. They need to do this because the dozers are likely to get stuck if they travel back and forth on the saturated silt clay soil. The uphill excavator tries to place soil and not mud in front of the dozer so it can be pushed outside of the lake being built. Neither excavator operator is using logs, so there's a real concern the machines will get stuck. Yes, even excavators need to shower occasionally to clean off the mud. The rate of water level increase was measured each day. The average depth of open water was monitored by conducting kayak surveys in the excavation area. Adam Hunter used a survey rod to measure water depth at 5-meter intervals along parallel transects. The measurement points were estimated from the shore using a rangefinder. Measuring the average depth of open water allowed the construction team to ensure that the overall average depth was meeting the target depth of 1 meter. Water levels were recorded daily by placing a fixed stake at the water's edge. The water level against the stake was measured at the beginning and the end of the workday to calculate the rising rate per hour. These measurements confirmed that water was continually rising throughout the construction period. Water entered the newly excavated areas from previously excavated areas, causing the level of water to fall on October 24th and 25th. Snow began falling towards the end of October. Shatanana Lake began freezing on the evening of October 26, 2023. The accuracy of water level measurements after this date may have been impacted by the partial freezing of the lake for the duration of the project. A major problem in building deep lakes is the difficulty moving mud with heavy equipment. The dozer and the excavator can become stuck in the soft ground. The excavator operators used a technique to reduce the quantity of saturated soil that was removed during construction. Their technique involved temporarily leaving a narrow ridge of soil between the section of wetland they were actively digging and the dug area that had already filled with water. To reduce the amount of mud that had to be moved, the operator would dig a section of the wetland within its reach that was adjacent to a large area that had already been dug and filled with water. The excavator would remove the soil in the new section until the surface of the ground was about 10 centimeters higher than the water level in the adjoining section. Operator would be careful to leave a cofferdam or a narrow ridge about 20 centimeters wide between the section being dug and the area full of water. Next, the operator would dig the new section down to the desired depth. Once the new section has been dug to the proper depth, the excavator removes the cofferdam to join the two sections. The water rushes in and fills the new section that was dug. The operator will then move the machine and begin digging another section, again temporarily leaving a cofferdam between the section being dug and the adjacent area now filled with water. This process reduces the amount of mud that has to be moved. The cofferdam in this photo would have been easier to remove before each cell filled with water. The large piles of mineral soil are shaped and spread using the dozer and excavator so they will appear natural. Ridges and naturally appearing valleys are formed that will help make the soil that was removed blend into the landscape. The excavator shapes this pile of mineral soil into a natural-looking ridge. Here the excavator pulls back the topsoil that was piled near the trees so that the dozer can spread it over the mineral soil. The topsoil that was saved is now spread over the soil that was removed from excavating the lake. Both dozers and excavators are used to spread the topsoil. The excavator spread topsoil over wet ground and areas where dozers are likely to get stuck. Heavy equipment tracks are removed and compacted soil is loosened and prepared for planting using the rough and loosen technique. Topsoil has been spread over the mineral soil on the steep hillside that's bordering one side of the lake. The dark areas where topsoil has been spread over the mineral soil. Notice the topsoil has been loosened and there are no tracks left behind by heavy equipment. Slopes treated using the rough and loosen technique will not erode and will soon grow a diversity of native plants. Isn't this amazing? See how quickly Shatanana Lake is filling with water and construction is still taking place. I like the bays and the peninsulas that give the restored lake a natural shape. The Shatanana Lake North project restored 1.1 hectares of deep open water in a dry lake. In addition, 37 ephemeral wetland basins were created on the soil that was removed, and 4.9 hectares of ground was planted. Approximately 150 large diameter logs were placed to provide the western painted turtles with basking sites. A third of a hectare of turtle nesting habitat was created. Western painted turtles quickly found the restored lake and the basking logs that were placed. Project accomplishments included the construction of 1.1 hectares of open water, 37 wet meadow basins, 6.7 hectares of planting area, 0.3 hectares of turtle nesting habitat, and 2 watering ponds. Shatanana Lake North is naturally filled with water 1 year after construction. The water in the lake is clear, and there is no visible erosion in the soil removed from restoring the lake. A temporary fence was built around Shatanana Lake North to keep out ungulates while newly planted native riparian vegetation becomes reestablished. A diversity of native plants is growing on the loosened soil that was removed and spread. The lake is now reconnected with groundwater. As the drone flies over the dry Shatanana Lake South, we see 2 small wetlands that were built as part of the project to provide a reliable source of water to wildlife as long as the fence is in place. These small wetlands will also be used to track fluctuations in the water table in the remainder of the lake to help guide future plans for restoration. The restoration of Shatanana Lake North show that it's possible to reconnect a dry lake with no stream inlet with its historic and natural source of groundwater. I sincerely thank the Yakaaknuk-Thiat First Nations community for their strong support, along with the Columbia Basin Trust and the Real Estate Foundation of BC for making this project possible. If you happen to live in an arid region and you know where there's a dry lake or wetland, guess what? It may be possible to bring water back into that valuable ecosystem. I recommend getting out there and digging some test holes and following the guidance that you learned in this video. Well, if you liked this episode, please mark that you liked it. And please subscribe so that you won't miss any future episodes in this How to Build a Wetland series. I wish you every success getting out there and planning and building wetlands in your area. Thank you.